Anders kan ik het niet meer, toch? Dat moet je gewoon. Ready? I'm going to do broadly 4 things with this extension. We're going to prove, firstly, how we get better results on climate change and how we incentivize Western states and rich states to deal with that problem. We're secondly going to prove why we get less war and dodgy interventions. We're thirdly going to prove why these states now have an incentive to improve themselves if they can. And fourthly, we're going to talk about why we improve the lives of illegal immigrants who we owe an obligation to. Cool. So, starting, like, everything will mainly clash, and anything that doesn't, John will deal with. First of all, on climate change. OO say we are going to take in refugees. That doesn't necessarily mean that the states who take in the refugees are going to like it and they are going to see it as a suboptimal outcome and they are not going to want to prevent this. They also say that, like, oh, we can't afford to take in loads of migrants because it will collapse the economy, yada, yada, yada. This means that the interests of Western states and non-Western states are now going to be aligned because presumably those states are going to want to keep them out. OO say we can't ever make Kenya as rich as the UK. Well, we can try. Like, we're not doing enough right now. The UK spends 0.7% of its budget on foreign aid. That is a pittance compared to what we give to the Queen. I think that even if we can't, like, produce the, like, most perfect outcomes that we want, we can incentivize people to do better. That's our extension. So firstly, on climate change. We are facing the greatest threats to humanity we have ever seen or will ever know. The seas are rising. The sun is really hot. This means that fires are breaking out everywhere. This means that we have no ability to grow crops. This means that the ozone layer is being destroyed and the sun is going to burn all of our skins, right? We have already seen this happen. We are already seeing the effects of this, and it is really bad. But there are some people in some states who are going to be better off. Why is this true? Because we're lucky enough to be born in moderate climates that aren't going to get super hot and are just going to get a bit hot. We're lucky enough to have money to be able to build flood barriers. We're lucky enough to be like the Netherlands, who do that thing where they extend their coastline so that if it floods, people won't go under. We're lucky enough to be able to build buildings which are on higher ground so that if it floods, the people don't necessarily have to notice it. And we are lucky enough to be able to develop technologies which deal with it, like those things you put in the sea that, like, eat up the toxins, and we are lucky enough to be able to patent them. It's critical to understand that we can keep these benefits and say fuck the third world even if they are impacted by climate change, because we'll probably be fine. Our lifestyles might change a little bit, but we don't have an incentive under status quo to care about the fact that most of Asia and Africa are going to be screwed. People will die, people will starve, they already are. Quality of life will decrease and override the limited progress we have made in developing those places. On their side of the house, people are going to flood towards the west and richer states, right? Like, people are already heading towards Calais in their thousands. They are already in refugee camps because they want to escape the torment that they have already faced in places like Syria. This gets so much worse in the next 50 years when climate change is like 10 times worse than it is now. But they will be kept out by borders, they will be kept out by security dogs, they will be kept out by custom checks. If they arrive, they will be sent to detention centres where they will eventually be deported. How does this get better on our side? They can move to the West. They can arrive in the UK and the USA and claim asylum. They can share in our prosperity. Western states are going to want to stop these people for all the logic that open opposition give you, because we're quite racist, because we don't want to spend a shit ton of money on these people, because we don't have the space, even though I'm sure that's probably not true, but it's something that gets bandied about in Britain a lot, that we just don't have the room to contain all of these migrants. So how then do our incentives change? Under status quo, people like Trump make a cost-benefit analysis to put their fingers in their ears regarding climate change. They take funding from lobbies that will have to get elected, and voters have a preference, if they work in like the steel mining industry or whatever, not to cut down on their consumption and actually do something about climate change. You can afford to not believe that it is real. Now climate change desires have a reason to help, because they are probably more racist than they care about like the marginal increase in something that, like how much something will cost if they cut down on using the least ecologically efficient example. And liberals, even if you believe in climate change, you now have a reason to want to share that with other states. What are the impacts of this? I think it means that you stop polluting as much. I think you have an incentive to cut back on your emissions and stop climate change as a whole. I think you're more likely to invest in green technology, but most importantly, you are more likely to release those patents to the developing world. Also, you're more likely to send money to them to build flood barriers so that people aren't incentivized to come to your country. This means that these people have better lives, and we can trick conservatives into saving the world. And we absolutely should, as we are the people who have fucked them and caused most of climate change. Next, what I want to talk about is war and interventions and stuff, because under status quo, you pay absolutely no cost for interventions in destabilizing countries. You can prop up dictators, you can lie about WMDs, and then invade Iraq. And there is a weak debate under status quo that says, well, we should keep these countries stable, otherwise there'll be loads of refugees. But it doesn't really work, because we don't really take many refugees, and OO can't just fear that we will take all the refugees that we want, right? Because people aren't going to want to take these refugees for reasons that they give. So we keep plundering and we keep intervening in countries, and we make money from it, right? On our side, you actually pay the cost, because the Iraqis are going to show up on your doorstep whether you like it or not. So you can go to Iraq, but Iraq will come to you. If every supporter of the Iraq war had to stand behind every migrant and cannon in their state, then they might just reconsider it. That is good because it, one, means that people can escape war if it happens, but it also means that people can stay in their homes because we're less likely to enter into those wars. This means that the people who can't leave, the sick, the people who don't speak English, are benefited from the knock-on benefits of us not saying let's stick our fingers in our ears about climate change, and they're benefited from the fact that a war is not happening in that country. But I also think you're just more likely to send aid to these countries if you don't want them to come. Emma.
So the United States already faces climate change issues when they literally don't have enough water supplies. They're still not changing their policy. Why do you think migrants and such an
exactly right, because they have the economic capacity to be able to deal with it. Third world states do not, and so under this policy, they are going to flock to the United States. You now have an incentive to share that technology with the third world. Fourthly, why you make life safer. They are going to come on both sides because they are poor, right? And you don't have much of a net for improvement on your side of the house. This means that they turn to human traffickers who treat them terribly, and it means that they don't feel comfortable going to the police when they have been abused, right? I think on our side you protect migrants, because even if loads of them come, you can at least say, we are not going to deport you straight away, and it means that the rug is swept out from under human traffickers, and that means that crime networks get less money. At the end of my speech, why do I think we beat OG? Because they talk about the right to live where you want and have enough money. I think we defend the right to life, and we defend the right of the earth to not be destroyed. I think we get less war, I think we get less climate abuse, we save the world, and that's an awful lot of people. But OG, we prove that this is a systemic harm and that we protect the most vulnerable, right? These guys say it's good for people who want to move so that they are rich. We say that this is a matter of life or death. At the end of my speech, thank you for listening to me. As ever, John, it was a pleasure speaking with you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech and call upon the member of opposition, Ashley Kinston, to take the case for the opposition. Here.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, states are the only way that people can come together to be more than their individual parts. The continuity of states is the only way that we can protect unique identities in the world and stop a homogenizing effect of assimilation that forces people to choose between who they are, how they see their place in the world, and economic opportunities. The team who wins this debate is the one who shows you that the world we want is the one that couples economic development for those who need it with people still being able to live the lives that the generations have lived before them and keep a unique identity without having to assimilate to a local power or hegemony. I want to talk about how we get better development on our side of the house, a more holistic development, but first I want 2 points of response to the closing government extension, 1 point to opening government. The first is on their extension about climate change. Because if it is true to say that there are people in the world who are going to be incredibly affected by climate change, and I think it is true to say that. I'm not denying anything here. I think that those people are the ones we need to prioritize more than the individuals who might just be economic migrants in countries who are closer to us, who might need to get something from us. That means to say that if we need to invest lots of money in being able to make it as cost efficient as possible for people to move from the Philippines to places like America to Europe so that they can actually escape that safety, that involves a lot of money to actually make it feasible to help those individuals, because the journey they have to make to get to those safe zones is much more than the economic migrants who can move. So if it is true that they are the most vulnerable actors in this debate, then the proposition should not stand over opening all borders and spending our resources in that way, but actually focusing on helping those individuals, getting them into the country and getting them out of harm's way, and using our resources to deal with that first. No, thank you. Their next thing was that this will trick Republicans into stopping climate change because they realize if they stop climate change, that will stop people moving into their country. I think that this relies on politicians being long-termist, which they're not. The easiest thing they can do is try and stop people coming to their country, not by stopping climate change, but by making their country unlivable for those people to come in. So you try and make the situation that those people will be coming into as bad as possible, because that's much easier to do than solving a global crisis. That is how you get the quick electoral win. That is further an incentive to make those refugees who are trying to flee those things, the lives that they get, as worse as possible when they come and they escape that existential threat. Finally, on respect to migrants and the illegal human trafficking trade, it will still be incredibly expensive for you to make your way from different parts of the world legally. So there will always be a black market of people who are trying to do it cheaper and more efficiently by offering you less and less safe boats for you to get across. I think that still exists on their side of the house. Next, on to opening government's principled claims about how you shouldn't be put into a box depending on where you are born. I think this completely ignores the reality of what mass migration, mass uncontrolled migration looks like. Because it looks like when Algeria and France had uncontrolled migration and free movement of people, and you saw massive ethnic enclaves spring up in France, for example, Clichy-sous-Bois in Paris. That means that people, enclaves tend to form because of things like you're not being able to speak the language, you're not able to, like the connections of the people you know who you decided to move to, all live in particular areas, you have cultural ties to other people where they might have set up a job for you. The fact of the matter is, they don't want people to be in boxes. You just see new boxes emerge within other states, and segregation, and that furthers the analysis about why people who are originally in that country feel under threat tend to self-segregate as well. The thing is, it is worse for them because they're essentially stateless. They can't vote in the states that they've gone to, and they don't have power to vote in the states back home. So they don't have any more access to opportunity, but also they don't have any access to official channels for change. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
The people who really want to move, whether for economic circumstances or due to climate change, will move illegally and face incredibly terrible circumstances. That's the comparative. Please deal with it. Those ethnic enclaves will still exist, but they have no legal rights.
So it's not true to say when our comparative is that you would do that through an official capacity of refugees, and trying to do that in some sort of controlled manner way obviously is not in your incentive for you to send them into ethnic enclaves. I think if it's controlled, you're able to mitigate that to a massive extent. Why do we help developing countries? I think these are the most important people in this debate, the citizens of non-developed countries, and probably economic migrants, because refugees can be accounted for in other capacities, whether they're religious refugees, people who are facing political or personal persecution. We think that you diminish the capacity of developing countries to develop for a number of reasons. One, they have fewer people because of mass migration, so they can't gain any sort of independence by attracting industry which enables them to develop as an independent country. Secondly, if they want to be the remittance economy that OG says is beneficial, while that might help individuals, that money goes into the pockets of families, but never into building roads between cities in that country. So you never get overall a holistic development. This is where the idea of states need to exist so that resources can become something more than just the wealth of individuals. They can go into not just houses, but housing projects so that you can have a more holistic development. Thirdly, donor countries have less political power when they have smaller populations and less economic power. In the global order, their standing falls in those capacities with respect to negotiating power. Why is it important that they have some sort of power in the form of individual states? Because states are not just land, river, water, trees. They're a unique history and identity. They're a unique culture and a unique place that exists within the world. You don't get a protection of that identity anymore, because when those people leave those states and are forced to move to those states because economic development in their states is worsened, they can't vote in those new countries and they can't control their countries at home. When you move, you are forced to assimilate to be successful. You are forced to leave behind the way you dress, the language you speak, in order to be able to live. This happens, that ultimately means people are forced to choose between their identity and economic development and a livelihood. This matters because we think it is important for people to be able to have a homeland but also have some sort of economic opportunity. You don't want them to lose access to that history and culture, but you need some sort of community sense in order to help people. You need to couple the existence of those identities with development. We think that doesn't happen when the quick fix solution is that you just move and you assimilate. We think there are other reasons why it's harder for you to develop as a developing country in this policy. You lose out on the guilt that Western countries have for colonialism because they think they're doing their fair share by having your people come to your country and they don't have to help you develop anymore. But also, generations need to make sacrifices. If it means we need people to stay in developing countries now in order for them to be successful in the future, we say maybe those people currently have an obligation to grow that economy now, to grow that country now, so that people can combine their identity with a livelihood in the future. Proud to oppose.
And indeed call upon the government whip to close the case to the proposition. Hear, hear.
Sorry, one sec. Okay. Can I start? Based on the reception of the previous speaker, I genuinely feel like an English rugby fan right now. I'll do my best. I'll do my best to try and win over the room, but I don't think I'll ever manage to do that. So I don't think I'll be too funny. I'm just going to try and win the debate, but again, we'll see. So, three main areas actually in this speech. One, we're going to talk about the countries these people leave. That is the countries that we're talking about here. That talks about the development that the closing opposition team want to bring up, and the extension we bring to you about the incentives of countries to help these individuals. Secondly, we're going to talk about climate change, why it is the most important part of the debate, and why it is something you should really care about. And then finally, I'm going to look at the host countries themselves, i.e. the US's, the UK's of the world, that opening opposition mainly wanted to talk about. Cool. Let's start with the countries that they leave. And to do that, we're going to start by looking at the extension that comes out of closing opposition. What do they tell you? They tell you that you're less likely to get development in these nations. Three responses. The first thing to say is that the one main thing they tell you is that because you're going to have fewer people in these countries, you're going to have less development. I don't think they prove that link enough. I don't know why it is that fewer people are going to lead to less development. I don't understand why that's the case. I would posit that it's more likely that with less people, you're more likely to be able to employ that population, and you're more likely to have people, less likely to have people on unemployment benefits and stuff. So it just seems like the contrary is true to me. But the second thing to say is that they give reasons as to why identity is important, right? And that is the main harm they talk to you about in the introduction. That is to say, identity is a core thing. They give reasons as to why it is that we should really care about identity and why everyone should care about it, and it's a really, really important thing to people. All of these note are reasons as to why it is that people would try and preserve their own identity when they leave their own country. When you move to another country, if identity is as important as closing opposition want you to believe, then they would preserve that of themselves. As someone who has moved from one country to another, I still feel just as Greek as I was the day I left. I still hang a Greek flag in my room. I think that's the kind of thing that people are likely to do. But the last response to give to this, and I think this is really, really important, is that it is reliant on a non-assertive response to our extension. Something I don't think we got. So let's look at how they responded to our extension on incentives of countries to help other ones. We brought you three main things. I'm going to deal with climate change and wars in a sec, but let's firstly start with the main thing about aid and development. I think it's quite fair to say that the countries that will be accepting refugees don't necessarily want to have a massive influx of refugees. We can see that they will have some refugees coming in, obviously, but we're telling you they will try and limit this influx. What does this look like? This looks like policies to increase development in these countries. For example, aid. They say on opening opposition in a POI, they essentially tell you that, you know what, we can't do it. I think that that is ludicrous to say. I think we already spend so much money on things we don't need to spend. I don't think it's that bad for the US to realize it should stop a massive influx of refugees and therefore literally stop spending billions of dollars into defense. I genuinely don't understand why they need to do that, and I think the point where many refugees are coming in, that is when their priorities change. The second thing to say here, and this is also very important, is that so much money is funneled towards things that they don't need to funnel that money towards. But then they tell you, in response, they tell you, you know what, they're already harmed by things like climate change, they're already harmed by refugees, therefore they are unlikely to change. The fact of the matter is, the Donald is not as clever as Emma. That response might work if he had the same rationale, but the difference is that the incentives that the Donald has are very different. What are these incentives? What was Donald Trump's main election based on, right? Donald Trump literally said, I will build a wall to stop foreigners coming in, and I will make them pay for it. Immigration is such a crucial part of why Donald Trump got elected that I genuinely think that when they are under the threat of having a mass influx of migrants, your priority changes and you try to stop that from happening. That's the extension we brought to you, which is why we have incentives for things like development to occur. I think we win on the point of development, but looking more specifically at the stuff that came out of opening opposition, which was just to say, you're going to get brain drain. I think that's massively unresponsive to OG that talked to you about skills and remittances anyway, so it's not really that massive of an issue in the debate. But the other thing to say, sorry about that, the other thing to say is that it is unclear why all the young clever people will leave the countries that they can. Because note there is a tension in their case. Because on the one hand they tell you that they screw over countries that could give them these opportunities in the first place. We're talking here about not like England's or UK's, but European countries that are kind of developed, but not really. We're talking about the Indias that can give you the opportunities. That is one case. In this case, you cannot work with the same analysis that opening brought to you in their first argument. Because their first argument was literally to say that, you know what, these people are going to leech off of the welfare state. If we are talking about brain drain, and if that's the main harm, then it is unclear why people are going to be leeching off the welfare state. The second case, though, is people that leave a country where no opportunity exists for them. In this case, I think we proved to you conclusively in closing that we make the situation comparatively better for these people. We also think we should be prioritizing the ones that cannot leave. Because closing told you, the important people are the ones that cannot leave these countries. This brings me on to the extension about climate change. Note this is really, really important because I think that climate change to an extent can break debates because you can literally say climate change is the most important fucking thing in the world and everything else should be secondary to that. We're guilty of that to an extent, right? But I think in this case it's fair because at the end of this note, that climate change is one of the biggest threats, if not the biggest threat, that humanity faces right now. And the way we need to combat it is to change the incentives from long-term into short-term. They respond to this just by saying, you know what, the likelihood is that you probably won't get politicians doing this because they'll probably just make life harder for immigrants in their borders. But that is still pretty bad, right? Like, imagine Donald Trump or any politician that is on the right, like having a country full of immigrants. That's not what they want, irrespective of how much they're helping them, because they view these people as criminals and they vilify them. They just don't want them there in the first place. Emma.
So solving climate change or solving inequality in the world is extremely difficult and impossible for one individual country. Why would one individual country send all of its resources there if they can never succeed?
Cool. It's not one individual country, right? We're not obviously talking about everyone just moving to the US. There are a lot of countries that presumably would have immigrants going into them and a lot of countries that probably wouldn't want immigrants going into them. In fact, I think European countries are probably slightly more guilty of this because they have far less space than the US does to keep all of these immigrants, right? I just think that it is far more likely that the priorities of these countries change, and you're more likely to have them doing something about things like climate change. This is also true, though, for things like proxy wars, because it is unclear to me why it is that countries would intervene in things like conflicts to create not only environmental refugees that are coming because of tropical diseases and food shortages, but also refugees as a result of war. That's why I don't think it is likely that the developed countries are going to have the incentive to continue to fuck over developing countries and make people want to leave them. At the end of this, we have taken it it over OG because we've proven to you a definite harm, a definite benefit, on our side. The fact that the behavior of individuals and politicians is likely to change because of their own perverse incentives. We use those incentives against them, and for these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government for that fine speech and call upon the operative, Ashley Tully, to conclude.
So nice before I went to a final. Woo.
Governments say that they stand with choice and support for the vulnerable. But when colonization and war has torn apart countries and forced the arc of people's lives, asylum programs and quotas are things that allow us to balance and tread the line of giving maximum choice and support to the development of those countries, but also allowing for the continued protection of people in countries around the world that might be influenced by those particular issues, especially the migration of people. What government has done is they've thrown that essential line that allows us to tread our capacity to balance those interests of people, to maximize choice, to maximize development, to maximize difference in the world, to give people a place where they truly feel safe to express their identity, which happens in developed countries where they have enough support to do that. And they have taken that opportunity to build those nations, to build those countries, to build those safe spaces, and thrown it out the window. We think that is unacceptable. The reality of the world that we live in today is that developing countries are just developing. They've just come out of war. They're still in war. They've just recently come out of being colonized. They genuinely do not have the capacity and infrastructure to support people in the same way that developed nations do. But the problem is that they have the capacity and infrastructure to support their ways that developed nations can never. They're not racist to people who, for example, may have the same color skin as them. They have things like a provision for those people to freely express their religion. They have things that allow them to identify with the history and the culture and the religion that is so essential to their identity, so essential to their family, so essential to them understanding what they are. When we create a situation where the only option for the people in that country is to leave because it's not livable anymore, we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we make sure they can never live in a world where their identity is truly able to be expressed in the way that we are privileged enough to be able to do in the Western world for many people in this room. Let's talk about what happens in developed countries. Because Ashling explains, let's talk about what happens in developing countries, because that's the point I wanted to talk about. No. Right, so...
Drop the sheet.
Yeah, that's okay, I don't need that. Yeah, here's the reality, right? So the situation that we're in at the moment is that we can't right the wrongs of exploitation in 10 years. Our burden in this debate is to provide the best quality of life for people in the future all around the world. CG say that we don't give reasons why life is worse in developing nations when we open all borders. Here are some reasons, and you'll also find some listed in Ashling's speech if they've been so kind as to listen. First reason, there are fewer people, so you can attract less industry. Second of all, you lose all the smartest people because they don't have to wait at borders to get into countries where they can earn more money in jobs doing better things, or at least they think they can earn more money in doing jobs doing better things. Third of all, you lose the richest people who are able to do things like support projects, support government, support industry, because they also leave to countries because they're able to pay for the airfare. And fourth of all, you lose taxes when all you have is remittances coming back into your country and you're unable to build infrastructure. That's why life is worse for the people who are trapped in those countries. What CG talked to you about, like CG tell you that identity isn't important, that you can express your identity identity anywhere. You can't express your identity in a country where it is illegal to be of a certain religion. You can't express your identity in a country where your religious expression is not protected. You can't express your identity when you're threatened in the streets for speaking in your own language. You can't express your identity when you're threatened in the streets for wearing a hijab. You can't express your identity when you're detached from the reality of supports that you would have in your own country. So what happens on our side of the house? You are forced with two choices. You are either left behind, where you can live in a world where you will earn less money, where you will live in a country with worse infrastructure, where you will have less opportunities, and where you will be left behind in the international order, or you can leave, and you can leave all behind all of the parts of your identity that are important. The problem is, you don't give anyone a choice. You've opened every single border in the world. It doesn't matter how long you've been out of war. It doesn't matter if you're trying to get out of war at the moment. It doesn't matter how long it will take you to develop, or the fact that you started so much later than everyone else. It doesn't matter that you've suffered from racism. You provide that country with no opportunity to protect its cultural integrity, and therefore you create the lives of the people that are living there now, and also generations well into the future. You make them significantly worse insofar as they do not have a place to come home, and they do not have a place where their identity is safe. But as Ashley explains to you, and it's completely ignored in the response in the WIP, you reduce the capacity for those countries to have some sort of global power, because the more you feel afraid to express your identity elsewhere, and the less presence you have in places that have alternative identities, alternative economic situations, alternative arcs of progress, the more homogenous the world becomes. The more homogenous the world becomes, the more power the most developed nations have in places like international organizations, but also in their capacity to dominate trade, in their capacity to set cultural norms on the international scene, in their capacity to dictate things like what should feature in, for example, the Paris Climate Accords or things like that. That means that these countries do not have their voice heard, and it also means that their capacity to control their development is worse on their side of the house. Here's the reality, right? It just takes longer than this for countries to develop. We think that it is worth protecting the capacity to create a country in the future that protects people, their economic power to progress, and also their capacity to express themselves freely and to have a safe place for their identity. And that is a worthwhile cause for which we will take a hit on this side of the house, in the same way that we can assume industrialization in England and Ireland took a hit for us to live in the place we are today and be in the situations we are today. We think that is a general good for the world, and we stand over that because we think it provides maximum choice for most people. We're happy to wait a few extra years, open and go.
Why is protecting the Indian identity more important than letting me as a gay man leave the borders that the fucking English drew?
No, you can just say, like, we don't stand over you not being able to get asylum if you're like literally in danger of being locked up in your country. Like, we don't have to stand over that on our side of the house. We support increased levels of asylum, and we think that in a world where migrants aren't just viewed as economic opportunists and actually viewed as people who need help from the global community, we are significantly more likely to see programs that send those people help. And that looks, for example, like programs that we have at the moment for accepting more climate change or climate-affected migrants and refugees and asylum seekers in Western countries. But let's talk about developed countries for a moment, because closing government also entirely ignores Ashling's points about the fact that there are worse circumstances on the ground for people like living in the Clichy-sous-Bois in Paris and like living in ghettoized communities all around developed countries. You make it more dangerous for them to live in those places, in anti-refugee countries where they are threatened every day in the streets and they do have to hide their identity. But furthermore, when CG say, we'll just get people to help more with things like climate change, how do you get people to help more when there is anti-immigrant sentiment everywhere? Why is it in a politician's incentive to be like, no, I know you hate these people and you want me to punish them, but why don't we give them some money and hope that solves the problem? Why does anyone agree with their taxes being spent on that stuff? Why doesn't everyone just say, no, just make it harder for them to register to drive or to work in a job or to get medical treatment? Why don't they just make it harder for those people to have a quality of life there? But also, there are climate change asylum seekers now, and that's not doing anything. So what is the difference? They never explain to us why we've reached the essential saturation that gets it that way. Here's the reality, right? If there are dodgy budgets as it is, and if you can't rely on tax income as it is, that just doesn't mean that you're going to spend all your money overseas to solve the problem. I was here 2 years ago speaking in CO with Ashley. That was our first competition ever. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.